Content warning. This episode contains discussion of murder.
So since we last talked about the Idaho murders, there have been some massive developments in that case. Namely, Bryan Kohberger, the suspect who's been under arrest and in custody since December, has actually been formally indicted in the murders of the 4 University of Idaho students. Today we're going to talk about some of those developments, go over some of the legal ramifications and language, and hopefully get a better understanding of everything that's happened recently in the case against Bryan Kohberger. My name is Anya Kane. I'm a journalist.
And I'm Kevin Greenlee. I'm an attorney.
We first connected while looking into the Burger Chef murders, an Indiana cold case. Together, we built a spreadsheet documenting hundreds of cases of restaurant-related homicides. That original spreadsheet gave way to our podcast, the Murdersheet.
Now we maintain that same research-centric, investigative approach as we look into all sorts of homicides, including unsolved cases, historical crimes, and, of course, restaurant murders.
We don't just chat about the headlines. Our podcast is a platform for our journalism. The Murdersheet focuses on investigative reporting, thoughtful analysis, thorough research, and in-depth interviews.
We're the Murdersheet.
And this is the University of Idaho murders, Bryan Kohberger's indictment.
I guess maybe the first place to start is to discuss what didn't happen, which is what we expected to happen, which was we expected a preliminary hearing. Mm-hmm. And to oversimplify things a bit, a preliminary hearing is a bit like a mini trial where we would have seen witnesses called, cross-examined, we would have seen some evidence brought forth in this case. Now, that didn't happen. Instead, they decided to go the route of the grand jury. The biggest practical difference for the public between the grand jury and the preliminary hearing is that in the preliminary hearing, we, the public, would have gotten to see and hear this evidence, and the defense would have gotten a chance to try to poke holes in it, basically. So let's talk for a moment. Why do you suppose they did not do the preliminary hearing?
I don't really know necessarily. I don't know if I have much to say on what the strategic differences would be for the prosecution. I kind of feel like both of these roads lead to the same place with an indictment for Kohberger. That's what the ultimate goal is. I guess
there were some possibly cynical reasons for going this route.
Yeah, what are those?
There's also possibly more altruistic, for lack of a better word, reasons to go this route.
One reason I think that would be altruistic to go the route of a grand jury is that since a grand jury, obviously a grand jury's work is secret, right? That's the nature. It's confidential. And we can talk a little bit more about what grand juries do and what they are in a moment. But that preserves, I guess, witnesses from the glare of public scrutiny, which we know is very intense around this case.
Earlier in this case, just a couple of weeks ago, there was a bit of controversy in that the defense was trying to get the witness Bethany Funk to appear at the preliminary hearing, and she didn't want to do it. And that really calls into focus the fact that going to a preliminary hearing, being sworn in, sitting in front of the world, discussing some of the most traumatic incidents of your life, knowing that everything you say is going to be broadcast around the world, that is a tremendously difficult position to be in.
Yeah, especially for such young witnesses in this case. Remember, these are college students. So I think that from the prosecution's angle is good for their witnesses and therefore good for them, because you're saving it all up for the ultimate trial. It's not dragging people back and forth essentially. Cynically, I guess if you have a prosecution that's maybe wanting to kind of keep things under their hat a little bit more before trial and not have everything, go out into the media and blow up, perhaps that, is also a helpful way of doing that by having things go via a grand jury.
And certainly this prosecution has expressed, obviously they have a gag order in the case. They want to try to keep things, as you say, under their hat. So that could be, if you want to be cynical, they may be trying to hide the fact they have a weak case. If you want to be more altruistic, they're trying to protect witnesses from the strain of having to appear at a preliminary hearing and then be cross-examined in front of the world. And then, months or however long down the line, having to appear again at a trial and having that be before the world.
I will say this is my personal opinion. I don't think they have a weak case. From what we've seen so far, the PCA was pretty professionally put together, and it was a lot of evidence pointing to Mr. Kohberger. If we get to trial and then, it falls apart, then certainly I'll stand corrected. I'm thinking from the initial look of this case, when you're looking at cell phone evidence, when you're looking at physical evidence, possibly when you're looking at witness evidence, things are coalescing around Kohberger in a way that I think, at the very least is a decent case. So
I'd go so far to say it appears, at least based on what we know, it appears to be a strong case.
So yeah, we can, this may be a mitigation strategy for the level of public scrutiny this has received, which they seem to be trying to mitigate. And you and I are always about openness, and so we would prefer when things are just out in the open and people are allowed to speak, no gag orders. But I can also, from a perspective, I can understand it a bit when you want to make sure that people, are kind of not impeaching themselves before they actually get on the stand.
Yes, and also there's the fact that when this starts being addressed in a public setting in court, there's going to be all sorts of what I imagine to be some pretty horrific details about bodies and manner of death that I think would be very difficult for some of the families to hear repeatedly. And it's one thing to do it in trial. If they go into that sort of thing in the preliminary hearing, I think a lot of people will be loudly speculating about it in great and perhaps gross detail over the next few months before the trial.
That's true. I will say this. So what exactly is Kohberger indicted on? Like, what are the charges? Well, he's facing 5 charges. The first, from the grand jury of Laydock County, the felony charge of burglary. Then 4 charges of murder in the first degree, 1 for each of the 4 college students, of course, Kayla Gonsalves, Madison Mogan, Ethan Chapin, and Xander Knodel. So that is what, and honestly, it's kind of chilling reading. It's very simple language. It's a very short indictment. It's just, here we go. Here are the 5. But for the burglary charge, he entered 1122 King Road with intent to commit the felony crime of murder. So murder is actually even mentioned in the portion about the burglary charge. And then basically 1 by 1 for each victim, the indictment says he did willfully and lawfully, deliberately, with premeditation and with malice aforethought, kill and murder 4 human beings by stabbing them from which they died. So very simple language, but it's kind of getting this kind of 1 by 1, stabbing them each to death, almost reflecting the crime in a way. It's very chilling. And then this was presented to open court on May 16th, 2023. And I mean, honestly, my first reaction on this, and this is why I'm not a lawyer and Kevin is, was, wait a minute, he wasn't indicted already? You often kind of assume, like, oh, wait, he's the suspect. You're not really, I don't necessarily have the mind of like the process that you do. So my initial, when I'm reading the headlines, I'm like, wait, is my Google News like backfiring? Is this like, no, but he was arrested in December. He was held without bail, and he waived his right to a speedy trial. That was voluntary on his part. But he's being held without bail on suspicion of the the indictment has just happened. So that's basically, that's that's basically this is the latest legal hurdle that the prosecution has cleared to take him to trial and attempt to hold him accountable for, what they're alleging he did, which was kill these 4 kids. So for me, and I'm sure for a lot of our listeners, you're kind of, maybe some of us thought the indictment had already happened, but I guess in some instances like this, if there's enough evidence, they can hold people for a while and then, indict them later. And as we noted, there would have been 2 routes to doing that: the grand jury, which they took, or this preliminary hearing where they're basically having to say, like, listen, he's constitutionally innocent right now. He hasn't been convicted of anything. So, here's why we need, here's us justifying keeping him incarcerated and taking him away from his life for, because we think the evidence against him is that strong and we need an indictment, essentially. I mean, before we kind of jump into this, I'm wondering if you had any thoughts on like the grand jury process and like how that tends to work. I think people who follow true crime, they're aware of, cases where a grand jury was sort of instrumental in making things happen, or maybe not. Maybe things didn't happen with a grand jury. But can you tell us a bit about what those are?
The grand jury is basically a panel of ordinary citizens who serve for a limited time. A prosecutor will present evidence in specific cases before them and give the jury members a chance to vote on whether or not to issue indictments or charges in those particular crimes. The cliche you always hear is about how a good prosecutor can get a grand jury to indict a ham sandwich.
What does that mean?
Basically, it means that the grand jury is more or less a tool of a skilled prosecutor. In some cases, this doesn't apply in the current case, but in some cases, if a prosecutor wants to deal with a controversial crime or something and wants to distance himself a little bit from it, he can say, well, I wanted to do this, but the grand jury wouldn't return an indictment, or, well, it was the grand jury that decided this. But generally, prosecutors are able to manipulate grand juries into doing whatever the prosecutor wants.
That seems a little ominous, to be honest. But I mean, that is how the system works. And it's all very secretive. It's not open to the public. The reporters can't go sit in on a grand jury. It's just it's all behind the scenes, essentially. I mean, I know the famous grand jury kerfluffle that comes to mind for me is in the murder of JonBenet Ramsey. A grand jury recommended indictment for her parents, John and Patsy Ramsey, and basically the prosecutor in Boulder, Colorado, I believe it was Alex Hunter, kind of sidestepped that and didn't proceed with anything based on those recommendations. So that was maybe a famous case of a prosecutor can kind of do whatever they want with a grand jury. You're like, I tried, the grand jury just didn't go for it. And it's kind of like, well, how hard did you try? In this case, obviously they tried hard and they got it, but that's not necessarily surprising.
And that's how it works in practice, is that the grand jury often seems to rubber stamp decisions by prosecutors. Maybe that's a bit harsh. Certainly, in theory, the idea of the grand jury, the reason why we have grand juries, is to provide a check on the power of the prosecutor. If a prosecutor issues just absolutely ridiculous charges or arrests a person for a ridiculous reason, in theory, the grand jury could hear that case and say, no, this is ridiculous. We're not going to return an indictment here.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Obviously, that doesn't apply in this case because, as we say, the evidence against Kohberger, at least based on what we've heard, appears to be quite strong.
Absolutely. And so this will essentially mean, according to NBC, that the case is going to go directly to the state's felony level court. It's going to go directly to the state's felony court level. And there's going to be no preliminary hearing process. That's all moot at this point, and we're all moving on, essentially. So that brings us to our next topic about something that's happened in Idaho recently. And on Monday, May 22nd, there was a pretty important hearing at the Laydock County Courthouse. It was not a long hearing. News reports indicate that I think it lasted about 15 minutes and was just very procedural, very sterile, rote in nature, sort of just one of the parts of the process that have to be done. But it's still pretty pivotal because it was essentially the arraignment of Bryan Kohberger. Tell me if this is wrong, but in court, when you're arraigning someone, you're basically hauling them into court saying, do you plead guilty or innocent, basically, right?
Yeah, basically, it's very important relatively early on in the process to give the defense, the defendant in particular, a voice. And usually, of course, you would expect the defense to plead not guilty because that keeps the process going. If at this stage you say, I plead guilty, you start going on a different track. If you say, I'm not guilty, you keep more options open. You can certainly go ahead and plead guilty down the line. You can negotiate plea agreements. So what you're pleading at an arraignment is not necessarily going to be written in stone forever. It can always be changed. Right.
And as you said, it's like if you plead guilty, then presumably we're going to be slouching towards sentencing. And it's okay, you pled guilty. How do we punish you? What does this look like going forward? Innocent, I plead not guilty. Then you have a situation where if you plead not guilty, as you said, that can change later, but it's about, I want to keep the process, keeping the ball up in the air, so to speak, and things could change, or maybe I'm going to continue to maintain that I'm not guilty going into trial and the prosecution's going to have to try to convict me. But Bryan Kohberger did something that is a bit unusual. I'm not super familiar with this process, but it's certainly allowed within Idaho courts. And he actually didn't say anything. He stood silent.
And that has the practical effect of making a not guilty plea.
Yes. Now exactly. That's not a situation where the judge is like, well, what are we going to do? And then they're all staring at each other for 15 minutes. That's very much like, okay, writing you down for a not guilty. That's the automatic process. You stand silent, you get written up as not guilty. And, our understanding is that from media reports, Kohberger's defense attorney, of course, Ann Taylor, she basically stood and said, Your Honor, we will be standing silent. So she's clarifying, he heard you. This is our strategy.
And he certainly indicated that he understood the charges because I believe earlier he was asked, do you understand these charges against you? And he indicated he did.
Yes. He responded yes to each one. They took him through all 5. Here's what they are. Here are possible sentences. Do you understand this? Yes. So he's definitely understanding that he's just not weighing in on the guilty or not guilty question. And that is a legal strategy. People have been talking about that a lot in the press. I've seen different news reports. People are speculating, is that like a very strategic move? Could he be going for an insanity defense? That's a big question. By not saying anything, by not committing yourself to guilty or not guilty, are you leaving the door open for something like that? Where it's like, I did this factually, but I was not competent. I'm not, this was a mental health thing and it qualifies for insanity.
The murder sheet ensures that we stay busy, running around and reporting on true crime stories.
That means that HelloFresh has become a key part of keeping our week less hectic. This is America's #1 meal kit for a reason. We've enjoyed the journey of becoming at-home chefs and preparing delicious meals without blowing our budget or wasting a ton of time. One recent dish we really enjoyed was the spicy Peruvian chicken and loaded rice with pickled jalapeno and creamy salsa verde.
The chicken was nice and tasty with plenty of spicy flavors. HelloFresh really knows how to pick out ingredients, so you're getting that farm-to-table feel.
One thing that was almost as good as the food was the peace of mind knowing that I didn't botch a grocery trip and forget a key ingredient. We could just be in the moment and have fun cooking together.
Whatever your goals are this summer, consider HelloFresh. If you're looking to connect with friends and family with some backyard cookouts, then keep in mind their crowd-pleasing options like snack boards with pretzel bites, spiced bar nuts, and hot honey peach jam. And if you're trying to mind your health and eat well, you can opt for the Calorie Smart or Protein Smart options. Go to HelloFresh.com/MSheet16 and use code MSheet16 for 16 free meals plus free shipping. Again, go to HelloFresh.com/MSheet16 and use code MSheet16 for 16 free meals plus free shipping. That's HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit.
Well, one thing that I learned that was very interesting is, according to a 2013 paper published on the American Psychological Association's website, the insanity defense is not available in Idaho. That's not a thing there. You can't do it. It's not allowed. So, didn't realize that. But of course, every state is different. They're going to have their own wrinkles. That's not to say, though, that things like mental illness, mental health crises mean nothing to Idaho courts. That can certainly basically go towards a defense. It's just the formal guilty by reason of insanity is apparently not a thing in Idaho.
Certainly thinking back, I know certainly in some parts of the country, there is resistance to insanity pleas because some people have the sense that people will feign insanity as a way to escape the consequences of their crimes. Yes.
People basically take the view of, who cares if you have a mental illness? What you need to be accountable for what you did. I can certainly understand that thinking. I can also understand the other side of it, that if somebody, it gets very complicated very quickly, because I totally understand. I'm a very suspicious person by nature. I think you will contend, Kevin.
I will confirm that analysis.
You will confirm my analysis. I'm a crazy paranoiac. No, I'm just kidding. I'm very paranoid. I oftentimes, wonder, if somebody is basically performing some sort of mental illness and, is effective enough at lying, essentially, who's to stop somebody? What's to stop somebody from potentially reaping the benefits of an insanity defense? But at the same time, we've talked to many mental health professionals on this show, and they note that it's actually very difficult to do that when you're dealing with trained professionals, because they know what to look for, and they know what the symptoms are, and they can spot the little, discrepancies that maybe will make them realize that someone is malingering and not actually insane. So even with my sort of paranoid, suspicious mind, I tend to think that, maybe the idea of somebody, quote unquote, getting off easy because they pled insane is not as much of a thing as like the movies would have us believe. And they also believe that an insanity defense is a rough one because you're essentially admitting to doing it.
And also, if you use an insanity defense successfully, we're using the term insanity defense, generically here. I think different states have different versions of it. But basically, if you say you're less guilty, you're less culpable because of a mental illness, it's not as if the judge would say, "Okay, you're mentally ill. No, I guess we can't do anything. Go home.
Have a great life."
You would still be institutionalized. You still be within the system, and the government will still exercise its obligations to protect the public from you.
I think the part of this is like historically, we've all of us who are like reading Wikipedia pages of awful murders late at night because that's what we do, have read about cases where, this guy was basically a habitual sexual offender who kept on doing stuff to people and eventually escalated to murder. And you hear about he was in and out of California mental asylums like 50 times in the 70s. And you're like, okay, what are we doing here? So I get why people have a skepticism about things like that, but I tend to agree with you. But yeah, we've all seen those kind of cases where you're just like, are you serious that you couldn't put this person away?
Yeah, I mean, I remember going back quite a while ago. I remember how upset the public was at the time when John Hinckley, who took some shots at President Reagan, attempted to assassinate President Reagan,
and paralyzed his Brady,
his press secretary James Brady. he was able to successfully use an insanity defense. And I remember there were large swaths of the public at that time who were outraged by it. I remember it was a huge controversy at the time.
Yeah, it's like basically you try to kill the president and then you're kind of, he's out now. So, it probably benefited him in that way to do insanity, right? But I guess if mental health professionals deemed him insane, then, is the goal to punish? Is the goal to rehabilitate? I think those are conversations.
Yeah, that goes back to a conversation we often had in law school. What is the point of punishing people? Are we punishing people to get revenge? You did something bad, and so we want to get revenge. Are we doing it just to deter other people? We want people to say, oh, if you do this, something bad is going to happen to you. Look here. Are we doing it because we want to rehabilitate the person who was the wrongdoer? In other words, are we trying to make sure that this person, when they are released, will go and basically sin no more? Is it a combination of those things? Is it something else entirely? It's a difficult question, but basically how you deal with people in the criminal justice system, how you believe people in the criminal justice system should be dealt with, the answer to that depends on how you view the point of punishment.
Yes. And of course, then there's containment, right? People who are habitual offenders who are, incorrigible and, continue to do wrong despite having opportunities to redirect and have hurt people so badly that maybe they shouldn't be around people anymore. They're too dangerous. But I would imagine that would probably only, that wouldn't necessarily describe every single offender who's incarcerated, obviously. But I think, I don't know. I have so many thoughts on this. I'm not going to go off on a rant, but
people love it when you go off on a rant.
No, I'm not going to do it in this episode. We're going far afield. As far as the insanity thing, there's definitely a conversation happening around mental illness, mental issues, and basically crime, and how does the criminal justice system deal with that, and what can we do to help people maybe before they commit a crime, and so it's all very complicated. But I guess that's off the table to some extent in Idaho because that's not a thing there. We do now have a bit of a sense of the timeline, though, going forward. So previously, there had been this preliminary hearing set for June 26th. That was sort of what everyone was looking for. That's off the table now. Don't worry about that. So what we're actually looking at is trial for October 2nd. Basically, people are estimating 6 weeks. Is that going to happen? Are they going to stick to that timeline? Probably not. I don't know, but not necessarily. As we've seen with the Delphi case, sometimes placeholder dates get set down and there's kind of an acknowledgement, like we'll all regroup in a few weeks and see how we're feeling about that. So just because a date is on the books does not mean that that's absolutely when it's going to happen.
That's exactly right.
And so many cases just get pushed back and pushed back and pushed back. So it's not, So, that's how things are standing in the Bryan Kohberger case. It's been a big development, obviously, having him be indicted. Although, frankly, the grand jury involvement means that we, the public, are going to get less information from these preliminary hearings. Obviously, that's okay. All of this will come out at trial, I imagine.
And another thing to be looking for, not just the trial date, but another thing to be looking for in the near future is something that is much less elastic, is much more definite. The prosecutors have 60 days to announce whether or not they will be seeking the death penalty for Bryan Kohberger.
Yes, Idaho has a death penalty. It's a death penalty state. It is, from my research, relatively rarely carried out. But it's definitely on the books. And we've had a lot of people talking so far about how 4 kids in the prime of their life, enjoying the college experience, beloved by their families, somebody sneaks in the middle of the night and cowardly stabs them all to death. That is a heinous crime. It's captured international attention. It's traumatized the other students in this community. It's traumatized these 4 families. And so, is death penalty going to be on the table here? And so far it is, but there may be a final moment where that can be allowed. So I will be very curious to see what they do with the death penalty here. I think regardless of whether you're pro-death penalty, ambivalent, or anti-death penalty, that's going to be something people are interested in. One note, and tell me if I'm wrong, Kevin, but oftentimes when you throw death penalty into the mix, there's like automatic appeals and things like that.
It makes everything more challenging. And if you have to, people in law enforcement, people in prosecutorial positions often have to be pragmatic. It also makes things more expensive.
Makes things more expensive, and it makes things more complicated. So, the heinousness of the crime is not going to be the only thing that the powers that be are looking at here. It's going to be like, can we pull this off, essentially? And also, I imagine the families, they may all have different feelings about that. Do they want the death penalty? Sometimes families do. Other times they don't. It's very complicated. It's very emotional. But, it's just, I don't think we can make any assumptions either way about that until we get more information. And then the last thing, this is sooner than later, but June 9th, there should be a hearing around the gag order. Kaylee Gonsalves' family has come out against the gag order. They want it loosened. The media wants it loosened. So there may be some opportunity to carve out a bit more opportunity for these different groups to get around the gag order without potentially damaging the case, which I'm sure everybody wants. But that's going to be June 9th. We'll be looking at that with interest. Obviously, we're always going to be free speech and kind of get stuff out there, even though we know it's nuanced. But we'll be looking at that. And tune in. We'll try to do some more updates if more developments happen in the Idaho case. But thanks so much for listening.
Thanks so much for listening to the Murder Sheet. If you have a tip concerning one of the cases we cover, please email us at murdersheet@gmail.com. If you have actionable information about an unsolved crime, please report it to the appropriate authorities.
If you're interested in joining our Patreon, that's available at www.patreon.com/murdersheet. If you want to tip us a bit of money for records requests, you can do so at www.buymeacoffee.com/murdersheet. We very much appreciate any support.
Special thanks to Kevin Tyler Greenlee, who composed the music for the Murder Sheet, and who you can find on the web at kevintg.com.
If you're looking to talk with other listeners about a case we've covered, you can join the Murder Sheet discussion group on Facebook. We mostly focus our time on research and reporting, so we're not on social media much. We do try to check our email account, but we ask for patience as we often receive a lot of messages. Thanks again for listening. Hello, Murder Sheet listeners. Thank you so much for sticking with us until the very end. Just wanted to take a moment as we close out to thank our sponsor, HelloFresh, America's #1 meal kit. They are #1 for a reason, folks. Kevin and I have been loving the meals we're getting from HelloFresh. We're talking farm fresh produce, protein, all sorts of customizable options to get you exactly what you and your family need. It's very delicious, it's very nutritious, and it's quite affordable. So it ticks off all our boxes. We've been very happy with the service. And, would love for you guys to try it out if you're curious, or if you've tried it out in the past and enjoyed it, get that discount. It's hellofresh.com/msheet16. And then you're going to plug in the code msheet16. You get 16 free meals plus free shipping. You can't beat that. We've really been delighted by it. We work very hard on the podcast. It takes up a lot of time. It's our small business. We really enjoy the work. We enjoy conversing with all of you every week. But at the same time, it's nice for Kevin and I to kind of have something to do outside of office hours, and cooking these meals has been really fun. We're terrible in the kitchen, like disastrous. I mean, like I can tell you horror stories. I probably shouldn't get into it on the podcast, but I mean, some pretty disastrous moments involving our cooking. Nothing life-threatening, but definitely stuff that we tried to be overly ambitious about, and it either went horribly wrong or it ended up costing like way more than it should have because we didn't properly think about ingredients, and we're not we're not gifted in the realm of the kitchen, but HelloFresh makes us pretend like we are because everything is so pre-portioned and pre-planned, and the instructions are super clear. So like, you're not going to mess it up if you're like us. And if you're good in the kitchen, then it's just less of a hassle, and you get everything that you need. You don't have to run out to the grocery store. So super nice. Try it out. I've really enjoyed the meals that they've sent us so far. I can say that Kevin has too. I highlight that because Kevin is pretty picky when it comes to food. He does not like everything. He has pretty strong specifications and preferences. Very much cares about things like fresh produce and farm produce and things like that. So he's very picky, and I think the fact that he is really enjoying HelloFresh is a testament to the quality here, because he's a stickler for that kind of thing. And so if you are, I think you will enjoy it as well. And again, the URL and promo code that'll get you a sweet discount is hellofresh.com/msheet16. That's MSHEET 16. And use code MSHEET16. You're going to get 16 free meals plus free shipping. We hope you enjoy it. And again, thank you so much for listening.